We've been talking in our section on doctrine of creation about various competing interpretations of the opening chapters of Genesis. And we looked at the literal interpretation of Genesis, which says that this is a quasi-scientific narrative of God's creation of the universe and of life in 6 consecutive 24-hour days. And I argued on the basis of certain hints in the text itself that that interpretation is not incumbent upon the Bible-believing Christian, and that on the contrary, there are some very good reasons to think that the author of Genesis 1 was not intending us to understand him to be teaching 6 consecutive 24-hour creative days. Now, let me ask if there's any further discussion about the literal interpretation before we go on to the second interpretation that I'll survey, the gap interpretation. Is that a question, Ben?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Down here, Steve, we need the mic for Ben.
Okay, as you might know, this is like the one area out of your 3-year Sunday school curriculum that I still feel like there's more biblical and scientific evidence for young earth, but I'm not dogmatic about that at all. And I'll limit myself to one comment and one question, I promise. But we didn't get to the lesson last week, but 2 weeks ago you were saying one of the big problems was that light was created before the sun, moon, and stars, and that you'd heard the explanation that the clouds just moved out of the way. I think that's kind of a silly explanation for it, for like explaining that away. But I think that if in Genesis 1:14, when it talks about lights, in the Hebrew, that's light bearers.
Yes.
And that says it in most of our Bibles on the sides of light bearers. And so I think it's important that the light was created before the light bearers. Throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, you know, God is seen in visions as light, and then in Revelation it talks about in the new earth that there will be no sun, moon, and stars because God will provide the light. So I don't think it's a problem that the light was created before the sun, moon, and stars. And then it also says that they were created as signs of the days and years. So it seems like days and years could have existed before the sun, moon, and stars because God had already established what those were. A sign can only be of something that was already established beforehand.
Yes.
It was a sign of something. So I don't think there's a problem with it being there, him having decided days and years and all that before the sun, moon, and stars were there to help us mark it, if that makes sense. So I just want to say those quick things. And then my question was, would you agree with me that theistic evolution, which typically does not believe in a literal Adam and Eve, is not compatible with Christianity, whereas old earth creationism that typically does believe in a literal Adam and Eve is compatible with Christianity?
I want to hold on that question until we get to that. I think that it's too early yet to ask that question, Ben. So let's hold off on the historicity of Adam and Eve. I did indicate already that I thought that the principal players in this drama are presented as historical characters. Principally God himself. He's clearly not a mythological symbol. He's an actual agent who creates the world. And then, as I said, Adam and Eve, though these are symbolic of humanity, the name Adam means man, nevertheless, they seem to be historical individuals in that they are connected by genealogies and descendants to indisputably historical persons like Abraham. So, I think that the interpreter, to be faithful to the text, has to deal with the fact that these principal characters are presented as historical individuals. Now, whether the theistic evolutionist can do that well or not, let's talk about that later. With respect to the light, it wasn't so much that there's light before the sun and the moon, but that these are 24-hour days. There's evening and morning, which would imply the rotation of the earth on its axis as it orbits the sun. And so if you do say there's light prior to the creation of the sun, then that would seem to suggest that these aren't 24-hour days after all, that in fact we're not talking 24-hour periods of time. So I think that the young earth creationist who takes that route is going to have trouble then defending his view that these are literal 24-hour days, since that is set up by the sun and the moon, or the sun. Now, with respect to what you said about them serving as signs, I made this same point myself back when we talked about the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, where I pointed out that the passage actually says, let the lights be for the purpose of marking seasons and days and seasons and years and so forth, so that it may actually presuppose that they already exist and weren't created on the fourth day. But then this again means that you're going to be interpreting the text in a way that is not just literal when it says God made these things and it was evening and it was morning the fourth day. So I think that while that is a legitimate option that you're raising, I question how well and comfortably that fits with the literal 24-hour day interpretation. Okay, some other question? Don.
I was watching a show on the Discovery Channel one night, and it was dealing with the earth and the creation and all this stuff, and they were talking about how the fossil record, they've gone into the fossil record and they've followed the fossil record back, and they hit a level, boom, and below that level there are no fossil records. And they even came up with a term for it. They coined it the Cambrian explosion.
Right.
Okay? My question is this. Is there anything in Scripture that could indicate that the 24-hour day was the day of creation, but they were not consecutive days? That there was a period between
that forms a very nice segue into the next interpretation we're going to talk about, which is the gap interpretation and then the day gap interpretation, which is going to put gaps of time in between the creative days. So hang on to that. I'll address it in just a minute.
So you knew I was going to ask that question before I did.
You're just thinking the way many interpreters are, trying to think of how might we understand this text. Okay, Brad?
Thank you. Is this on? Oh.
Yeah.
I'm back to, I'm a young earther.
Yes.
And I'm back to that the perfection of the writing of Genesis 1, I don't think indicates that it's poetry. I think it indicates the author. And last time we talked about the indication that when there's a number with day throughout the Bible, it tends to be a 24-hour day. And we talked about Hosea.
Yes.
And I went back and looked at Hosea, and I think the 2-day and 3-day are very short periods of time, but it uses a poetry technique called a chiasm. And you're probably familiar with it.
Yes.
That really indicates Hosea was poetry. And it's very similar to like Job, that from 6 calamities he will rescue you, from 7 no harm will come. It's an N and an N+1 that they use called a chiasm that indicates it's poetry, and it was for memorization purposes. So I still come back to, with the exception of that poetry, wherever you have a number and a day, I think it does indicate 24-hour days. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing is, how, if God wanted to communicate to us that it was indeed 24-hour day, this is how I did it, what other words would he use?
I don't think it's a matter of vocabulary, Brad. First, with regard to the structure, the chiasm that you mentioned, if you look at Genesis 1, it has all kinds of structures like this written through it. I mean, this is precisely what distinguishes this chapter as so carefully crafted. Look at Bruce Waltke's commentary on Genesis, for example, where he lays out a lot of the sorts of parallel structures that he sees in Genesis 1 that would be exactly indicative of the kinds of concerns that you would think are perhaps indicative of a more poetic kind of narrative. Now, as to the ordinal number indicating always a 24-hour period of time, as I said, when I dealt with this in class, that could simply be an accident of how much extant Hebrew literature we have, that you don't have very many cases where someone says the second day or the fourth day, and they're not talking about a literal 24-hour period of time. There's nothing grammatically in Hebrew that requires that when you have an ordinal number with day, that it has to be 24-hour period. And in Hosea 6:2, I think, as I said, you have an exception to that. So it could just be an accident of the extant literature that we have. And then the final point that I want to reiterate again, I don't think this even begins to address the question of whether or not a 24-hour day couldn't be used as a metaphor. I'm actually inclined to agree with you, actually, Brad, that the days in Genesis 1 are intended to be 24-hour days. But I don't think that that means that they're not metaphorical or that they have to be literal. I suspect that the use of the expression, it was evening and it was morning, is indicative that the author is using the notion of 24-hour days. And I'll say in response to the day-age interpretation, for example, that it doesn't seem like he's thinking of ages here rather than days. So I'm almost rather inclined to agree with you, but I don't think that even starts to address the question, couldn't someone use a 24-hour day as a metaphor for something else rather than literal? All right, let me take one more question from T1 and then we'll proceed to the next interpretation.
The New Testament and Old Testament starts.
Oh, wait, T1, I just remembered. I didn't answer Brad's last question.
Okay.
How might God do it? Well, he might provide a historical narrative that reads more like, say, the Chronicles, the book of Chronicles or Kings, where it clearly is just a sort of straightforward historical narrative, rather than a theologically and literary, a stylized piece of writing like Genesis 1 is, as Waltke says. This is not just a science report or a historical report like you would have, say, in the book of Kings or something of that sort. Okay, now, T1.
Well, the Old Testament beginning and the New Testament beginning may have some parallel where the light was created and then the governing bodies in the heaven. In New Testament, the Word was there, and then the embodiment of the Word. So in that sense, and also talking about there's plants first, and then the sun, moon, and star. It's almost like God created Adam and Eve, and then there's a new beginning with Noah's family.
Yes.
Because it's almost like there is beginning of his design, and then the sun, moon, and star kind of start kick in and take over as a new beginning. The rhythm of the natural law take place. So that's how I thought. I saw
would
it.
that be in support of a non-literal interpretation?
I think it's 24-hour day.
All right, because what you said didn't sound like it was supporting a literal interpretation. It sounded to me more like that the author was making a theological point.
Because, even with chapter 5 talking about Adam was 130 years and he bore a son, but when he was born, he was not an infant.
Right.
So 130 years, does that add the years that before he was even existed? So God is able to do anything and then catch up with whatever.
Yeah, Taewan is raising a really interesting point that is sometimes referred to as the omphalos theory, which asks the question, did Adam have a belly button? Did Adam have a navel? Because he was never born, right? He never had a placenta. So if he did, if Adam had a navel, then that meant that God created him with the appearance of age. He looked like he was 30 years old when he was only 5 seconds years old, for example. And so could it be that God has created the world with the appearance of age, but not with actual age? And that is this so-called omphalos theory, which appeals to God's ability to create things that have the appearance of age. I'm not going to say anything about that because that's not really a hermeneutical approach to Genesis 1. That's more sort of theory of apparent age that is a modern attempt to explain how the universe could be very young even though it looks very old. Let's go on to the gap interpretation. This is a view that was popularized by the old Scofield Reference Bible. It holds that there is a gap between verses 1 and 2 of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then there's this huge gap of time before God begins to work upon the earth and produce life. And it holds that during this gap, that's when there was a kind of primordial world, and all of the existence, or all of the evidence of fossil life, extinct life forms, and so forth, were of an ancient world that existed prior to verse 2, and which came under God's judgment and was then destroyed. And so what's described in verse 2 forwards is God's recreation, in effect, of the world after a long gap. So this view would say that all of the evidence that we have scientifically and historically of ancient geological periods, prehistoric life, and antiquity is from that pre-gap world that was destroyed by God prior to verse 2. Now, what might we say by way of assessment of this theory? Well, I think that there could well be a gap of time between verses 1 and 2 in the first chapter. Verse 1 describes, as we've seen, God's creation of the universe as a whole. The heavens and the earth is the way the Hebrew person would describe the universe as a whole. And then in verse 2, the focus radically narrows down to God's activity upon the earth. And the earth was without form and void. And it describes how God transforms the earth from a desolate, uninhabitable waste to a place that is fit for man to live in. So that there could well be a gap between verse 1, God's creation of the world as a whole, and then his transformation of the earth into a habitable ecosystem for human life. But the idea that there was a prior life world before this one is just utterly foreign to the text. The text is describing God's initial creation of the biosphere, and on each occasion it pronounces God's work as being good. God saw that it was good. And the idea that all of this is just a repeat of something that he's done before has absolutely no warrant in the text. Remember, all of this is supposed to be pre-flood. This is not flood geology. This is prior to Noah. It's saying that prior to verse 2, there was this prehistoric world of animals and geological epochs and so forth, maybe even ancient civilizations, that was all destroyed by God. And there's simply nothing in the text to support a view like that. In fact, I think that this gap interpretation seems to be an example of concordism at its very worst. You remember, concordism is the hermeneutic of trying to read modern science into the text, to try to read the text in accord with modern science rather than reading it as it would have been originally understood and written. It seems that under the pressure of the scientific and historical evidence of prehistoric life and geological time, one reads into the text something that was not at all intended by the author. And so I find this interpretation to be hermeneutically unsupportable. Any comments or question on this gap interpretation?
Atlantis.
Pardon me?
Atlantis.
Atlantis, yeah. It does make you wonder exactly who these people were and so forth. Yeah, any other comments or question on that? Yes, back here.
Have you ever heard that Genesis 1 can be interpreted as at summit, God fattened? That
Say again?
In summit, God fattened. Like a beginning is really ancient Hebrew for in the height, God fattened. And fatten is the same root word that Eli's sons were fattened with illegally taking the fat of the lamb. Baruch.
No, I'm not familiar with what you're talking about, Steve.
But it would I guess this would be contrary to ex nihilo, God created. It would be saying there were previous realms and this whole universe was created after one. And that the night and day
that goes
would
back to your interpretation of verse 1. And in the section on creatio ex nihilo, we talked extensively about whether or not verse 1 is an absolute beginning. In the beginning, God created. Or is this a subordinate clause, meaning when God in the beginning created, the earth was without form and void and so forth. And I argued extensively that in fact what you have in verse 1 is an absolute and not a subordinate clause. It's a main clause that does affirm that God has created everything, not out of pre-existing matter or prior worlds, but that this is the absolute beginning. And then the idea that there is something in between 1 and 2 that was destroyed by God seems to me to be just completely unsupportable from the text. It's, I think, the result of trying to read science back into it. Any other comment on this view? Drew, did you have a comment? Go ahead.
So I take it you're not, I guess, not as much about using the book of nature then to sort of add information to the biblical text. That's, I mean, that is concordism. Is that your interpretation?
Okay, Drew's question was, what is concordism? Is using the book of nature to illuminate the biblical text concordism? I think that the project of looking to the book of nature, as you put it, to see how it accords with Scripture, is the task of the systematic theologian, not the biblical theologian. The biblical theologian, I think, needs to look at the text and interpret it according to the genre of literature that it was, what we can determine about how the original author and his audience would have understood it, and try to understand what the text meant for him and that audience. And then the question of how does this fit into the book of nature and what science tells us about the universe we live in is a second project that will be part of systematic theology, where you try to integrate the Bible with the discoveries of modern science and history and all the rest. So right now, we're focusing just on this hermeneutical project, and we're going to talk about this other project later on, about how to look at the book of nature and see if we can make sense of things in light of it and the teaching of the biblical text.
So a systematic theologian then could then hold to these views or give these interpretations.
Right.
Okay,
That's a good point. In other words, the systematic theologian could hold to these views, but he wouldn't claim that this is what the original author meant. He would say, this is the way I'm going to reconstruct how the universe came to exist. But he wouldn't be making a hermeneutical claim that this is what the text is teaching. See, that's very different.
It would be like Isaiah 7's virgin, right? It might be, I mean, in a similar way, the virgin of Isaiah 7. It seems, it seems like Matthew was being a bit concordist in his interpretation of.
Well, now there you have a question of how a New Testament author interpreted an Old Testament text. That's different than what we're talking about here, where a systematic theologian reads the book of nature, right, and tries to integrate that with the biblical text to produce a biblical view of the world. And in one sense, maybe I'm being unfair to the proponents of the gap interpretation. Maybe this wasn't really offered as a hermeneutical interpretation of Genesis 1. Maybe it was what you just described, a theory about how to integrate Genesis 1 with modern science. And that's a legitimate project, so long as you're not offering it as a hermeneutical claim that this is what the original text said and meant and how it was understood. And so if it's not meant to be an interpretive affair, but the secondary project, then my objections here that it is unsupported in the text wouldn't be relevant. But my concern here is, first and foremost, how do we understand the meaning, the right interpretation of Genesis 1? And I think that this gap interpretation, frankly, is just preposterous. The idea that between 1 and 2, there was some prehistoric world that came under God's judgment and was destroyed. There's just nothing in the text to suggest that that's what the author thought. All right, next time we're going to take up the day gap interpretation, which is a slightly different sort of gap theory that puts the gaps in between the creative days. So that will be next time.